Hi, my name is Rosanne, and this is my Module 9 case study entitled When Ethics and Policies Collide for AEP 855. If we start with the facts of the situation, we're looking at what happened. The big picture of the situation, a student was found with a prohibited weapon on campus. This weapon was brass knuckles. How this came to light, he was called to the office for a truancy call to meet with the assistant principal. They have recently established a pretty strong relationship. Before this happened, when it was time for him to go to the office, an observing teacher saw an encounter between him and another student and reported the incident to the assistant principal. A police officer ended up escorting both students to the office where the weapon was found. It was found on the second peer involved, and it came to light that the first student ended up threatening the student in the hallway to hold the weapon. However, the police officer ended up taking both boys in handcuffs to a youth detention facility, awaiting their discipline process. The student holding the brass knuckles returned to campus, and the student who gave the brass knuckles to him to hold, so obviously he was the one that brought it to campus, was remained at the 45-day placement. Days later, the assistant principal faced a formal reprimand from the director of secondary education at the district level. If we look at who was involved in this situation, we have the assistant principal, Richard Inman. The first student involved is James, and the second student involved is David. We have the school police officer and the observing teacher, and at the tail end, like I said, the director of secondary education. When did this happen? It was a spring day, and it mentioned that it happened during fifth period. Where was this case study occurring? Rocket Junior High School was the primary setting. The exchange itself of the brass knuckles occurred in the school hallway. The incident came to light at Mr. Inman's office. And then the last setting was the youth detention facility, which is where the boys were taken by the police officer. If we look at the ethical and legal issues of this case, the legal issue is obviously both of these students are facing felony offenses. They're of age, that's at a junior high. This is a prohibited weapon. But you're also facing violation of school discipline policies. I'll get more into that here in a few minutes. But depending on how the situation could have occurred or should have occurred, this could be a violation. And then going along with that, there could have been a lack of due process procedures during this discipline incident. And then moving into ethical, inappropriate use of power. This could be seen from the police officer. This could be seen from the assistant principal, depending on your side of the situation and how it's interpreted. The operational systems of the school, especially discipline procedures, could be in question. And if Mr. Inman does not comply with the request from district, he is now in insubordination to his supervising authority. We were asked to establish a synthesized summary, which states Mr. Inman, a first-year assistant principal at Rocket Junior High, discovered a student who brought brass knuckles on campus and threatened another student into holding them. However, before Mr. Inman could appropriately investigate and handle the situation, the school police officer handcuffed both students and took them off campus to a youth detention center. If we analyze the people in this case study, we have the assistant principal, Richard Inman. He's a first year in this role at Rocket Junior High. He's been really focusing on cultivating relationships with students, especially those hard to reach students like James. And then it is obvious that student discipline is one of his daily duties. Our first student, his name is James. He was described as tattooed and muscly. It appears that he's the leader of his group. It is obvious, and it mentions that he's actually from the South Side. He has an extensive discipline history, and he's recently been improving his grades and staying out of trouble. The second student in this situation, his name was David. an honor student, a trombonist in the school band. He was very nervous during this whole ordeal, and he has a clean discipline history. The school police officer, he is on campus, and it appears that he makes decisions and implements the policies with or without school administration in their direction. This is very different than my situation at my school with our school resource officer. She is not involved at all unless I call her for a situation. The only time that she would kind of take the lead on a situation without my knowing or my initiative is if it were to occur outside of school hours and off school property, and she had to, gather information from myself or different school personnel, maybe about the history of a student. Other than that, if I don't call her and bring her into the situation, she is not involved, and she would follow my lead until it is a legal situation. And then the observing teacher was involved as well. They reported the incident in the hallway to Mr. Inman. If we look at the sources of power, Mr. Inman demonstrated a positional power. He is the authoritative role on campus, and he is, quote unquote, the legitimate leader in this scenario. James, he exhibited personal power. It was his choice to bring the brass knuckles on campus. He is an assertive personality. He's intimidating students. David expressed passive power. He was threatened into the situation. The school police officer, in my opinion, demonstrated two different powers. Coercive power, he, enforced the compliance legally. And then positional power, because he is an authority figure as well. And then the observing teacher expressed positional power. They were involved by choice, and they were more of that observed passive role. The place is Rocket Junior High. There's roughly 900 students. It's obvious extracurricular activities are offered on campus. In the case study, it mentions band and basketball after school. It could be assumed that it's a diverse community. You have reference to the South Side students. You have reference to different personalities and different patterns and behavior with different populations of students. And I'm going to assume that it is a bigger district. It has an established alternative placement for 45-day placements and other behaviors. They called it AEP. And so I'm assuming and inferring this based on my current district is a very small rural district. We don't have a 45-day placement established. We don't have the personnel in the setting and the numbers to do that. So in the situation that we would need a 45-day placement for a student, we would either kind of create one following the guidelines by law for that student, or we would actually outsource them to a private day placement and pay for those 45 days. And so that looks a little different. So that's why I'm assuming it's a bigger district. Analyzing the prioritized information, if we look at the stakeholders involved, we have the school and district administration, we have the staff members, there were teachers involved, and I'm sure other people saw this. Students, we have the direct students involved, James and David. Again, assuming that there were other students that observed and saw this happen in the hallway. And then the parents and family of the directly involved students. If we look at the impact, it could have a negative impact on the school culture and relationships. We don't know how entangled these two students were. I've seen if James is a very integral part to his peer group, there could be an uproar from his group with behaviors. They could be upset he's placed at a 45-day placement. If he had those to handle his business, he said, his group could kind of take it upon themselves to handle his business for him while he's gone. David, he has his own group. He's very intimidated, nervous. So you have many different personalities integrated into each other. You don't know how deep that those ripples may go. So it could impact the culture and relationships. Depending on the situation and how it's handled, there could be a misconstrued message to students and staff. Some people could look at it as, two students were involved, only one got punished. If David ends up going to the 45-day placement with James, you could have the school as kind of a facade, as like a got you facility. Our district is very big on, we're not here to get you. We're here to support you and educate you and kind of cultivate you into a very ethical, responsible being. So then you have an element of forgiveness and understanding, and students make mistakes. Very fine line with a legal issue and a prohibited weapon. Um, so there's a lot of messages kind of going into this. And then if you look at the investigative process and due processes that needed to be acted on prior to the school officer, in my opinion, being involved, or looking at the investigation and due process after the school officer is involved. So a lot of different here or there situations with this case study. Mr. Inman needs to consult with appropriate school and district leaders. He needs to communicate with them first and foremost. He needs to speak with the families, the students, any witnesses. They should have been addressed prior to departing campus as well, but definitely now before the hearing. And then a complete investigation needs to happen prior to this decision in consultation with the district level personnel as well as your site principal. If we look into options, option A, I said we could obviously ignore the request from the director of secondary education, receive reprimand, and kind of just let it flow as it is. Option B, you would comply with the request from the director of secondary education. This is obviously ignoring your personal beliefs and then sending David to that alternative placement. And then option C, it's kind of a mix of a few options, but option C, you for now would kind of ignore that request from the director as stated in option A, but you would ask to meet with district personnel and your principal. You would put together an appeal and revise school protocol for how these situations are handled. This would be a time for you to advocate your ethical stance on the situation, and then thus you're advocating for David. Looking at these options, option A, the consequences, you would have a official reprimand in file, could be a rift between your relationship with you and the director. Option B, it's not aligned with your ethical and personal beliefs. You could potentially infringe any success on David and his future if he has a situation going on. And the relationship with him as a student and his family, that could come into play. Any district personnel that may not agree with your action, if we look into option C, they could kind of have an issue with your relationship. Option C is very time consuming. You would actually have to put a proper appeal together, and then it's seen as after the fact. So depending on how quickly you act. Moving into evaluating these options, option A, you have a pro, you're staying true to your beliefs. David stays in class. The con, you could receive a reprimand, maybe insubordinate, negative impact with the director. Option B, you're complying with the director's request. The con would be, you don't know the impact of that placement for David's future. Your relationship with David is completely ruined. And then you have the con of ignoring your ethical stance and your integrity. Option C, the pro is that you stand up for your personal beliefs. You prepare a plan for flawed action. You're advocating for David. A con would be that it's time consuming. District personnel still might not agree with your appeal in the end, after all of your work. And then there's a lack of support with proposal for amended procedures. You don't know, it could be. So if we look at a best option, I would say option C. By acting in this option allows you to be proactive and evaluate the situation. You're demonstrating your beliefs and knowledge. This also demonstrates your desire to improve on policies and procedures. You're focusing on the students and their well-being and advocating for their needs. By making this decision, you're able to communicate and advocate ethical decisions while attempting to maintain a positive collaborative working relationship with your colleagues and the students. Additional information to consider at a collaborative standpoint among stakeholders. you end up reviewing discipline procedures. So time for due process and appropriate investigation. You're going to have these conversations at a collaborative working level with your colleagues. The leadership team could review necessary policies. How are you managing resources and school operations? Does this affect school level governance? You're kind of questioning different district levels, improve management, enforce ethical conduct. And then third, you now are reviewing and revising appropriate school mission and vision statements. That might be necessary. Is this action aligned with our mission and vision? What's the impact of student success, fair trial? All of these things kind of play into an impact. And then obviously your relationships with students and families. If we look at the implementation of option C, first you're going to request a meeting with necessary personnel to justify your position on the situation and appeal the discipline process in your handbook. That is, if it does not say that you need to do the due process and appropriate investigation prior to the school resource officer acting. Again, there's kind of missing information in this case study, in my opinion, just because I do this every day. So I don't know if that was the appropriate action or if the police officer should have waited. Or if the assistant principal did give him the go-ahead and that was just left out. Thus demonstrating your own understanding of these school policies and ethical practices. So next, you're going to put together a comprehensive plan of policies, responsibilities, and ethical practices. You're ensuring that this aligns to the school goals. You're going to outline a chain of command and a flow chart of appropriate behavioral decision making. And then lastly, you're going to include legal and ethical policies that need to be protected. And then finally, you're going to present this to necessary personnel. You're going to do this to ensure effective operational systems are developed for that student success and school development. When I was looking at this, as I was reading, I was like, oh, I kind of have had this experience. And there was nothing, I was really sad that there was nothing in the case study that mentioned the assistant principal's investigation, because that piece of student due process and student rights, collecting statements, viewing film, I'm sure they have cameras in hallways, talking to the teacher, talking to every person that could have been a witness, getting both student statements. All of those things play into a huge part in these situations, especially the student confession. If we're looking at James, he confessed in his office that it was his weapon. And so I have a really hard time kind of holding David to all of the action that ensued because of the lack of those due process policies and investigative processes. And so that's why throughout this case study, I was kind of saying, well, if you did this or after the fact or there shouldn't be, he should never have been handcuffed. If it says in their policy to handcuff, bring them to this detention facility, and then the principal is going to do all of this due process. He should never have to go through that hardship. That's very traumatizing, especially for a kid that appeared to be as innocent and naive as David. And so I kind of think there was a fine line of well, what's stated in their policy handbook, what did he do, what didn't he do? Obviously, any administrator is going to go through a lengthy investigation before a hearing, especially for a 45-day placement. So I know that all of this would happen. So those should all play into effect for the director to either reprimand the principal or not. And the director should trust that his employees, his assistant principal, is doing the job that they need to do. So, and then looking further into this implementation, this option could lead to further steps to enhance policies and practices. So it could lead to collaborating with internal and external stakeholders to ensure that mission and vision is aligned and they're advocating ethical decisions. You're ensuring appropriate discipline procedures are understood by all staff, including the police officer. By doing this, you're cultivating those ethical practices. And then you're going to ensure that these policies are outlined in the employee and student handbooks. And here are my references. Thank you so much.